and submit those to the Q&A. And we will get started. Hi again, everyone. I'm Leanne O'Neill. I am the Director of Legal Advocacy for FAIR. I'm very excited to be hosting this webinar today. We want to dive into the recent executive order signed by President Trump last week on ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schooling. There's a lot there. There's no shortage of content to go over and ideas and insights that we can gain from our wonderful panelists in terms of how this executive order might be implemented and what the impact will be. So thank you all for being here with us this afternoon and hearing from our panelists. I'm going to go through and introduce everyone, and then we'll get into the thick of this. So first, we have Candace Jackson joining us today. She is the Deputy General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Education. She served in the first Trump administration as Acting Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. And over the past few years, she has practiced law in Washington State and in California. I've had the great pleasure of working with Candace closely on another project that FAIR is working on to protect the rights of female prisoners in Washington State. An enormous help to us and always a wealth of information. So we're so glad to have her with us today. We also have Eric Smith with us today. He is a research fellow at the Cato Institute and the co-founder of Free Black Thought. He's also on the FAIR Board of Advisors. He's also an associate professor of rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. His primary focuses are the rhetorics of anti-racism activism and the theory and pedagogy, as well as the role of rhetoric in a free and pluralistic and civil society. So thank you for being with us here for this, Eric. And finally, we have Wilfred Reilly, author and professor at Kentucky State University. Will is the author of a few books, but most recently, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, which is fantastic and highly encourage everyone checking that out. But he is an American political scientist and, like I said, assistant professor of political science at Kentucky State University within the School of Criminal Justice and Political Science. And so I will definitely invite all of our panelists to plug any projects that they're working on, books that they have available as we go, because they're certainly a wealth of knowledge and we want our viewers to have access to that information. So again, the reason we're all here today is to discuss this recent executive order signed by President Trump. It was published on January 29th, and it targets federal funding in the public schools and aims to end the practice of what it calls indoctrination on topics such as race, ethnicity, and gender identity. This is obviously an issue that FAIR has closely followed. We have grassroots chapters across the country, and so that has allowed us to take in a lot of examples of really what this EO covers and what it's aiming to correct. And a lot of times, in addition to the issues that come up around gender ideology, we have seen countless examples of content that's presented to students from a particular and singular viewpoint that can really create a racially hostile environment. So this is an issue that we're deeply invested in and have advocated around. It's, I guess, rather appropriate that this week happens to be Black Lives Matter Action Week at school across the country, where hundreds of school districts observe that action week and teach the curricula that is sort of crowdsourced through the Black Lives Matter website. You'll find everything from innocuous lessons on, history lessons that I think most, if not all, Americans would really support being taught in schools to, like I said, singular viewpoints taught about really ascribing traits and characteristics to individuals based on their skin color, or teaching students that they, are sort of have a predestined conclusion to life, path of life based on their skin color. And so I'm really interested to hear from our panelists about how this executive order could change that. And I'm going to go to Candace first, view of the executive order and any of her initial thoughts on it.
Thank you, Leanne and FAIR for hosting a webinar on this. I'm going to go through, first of all, a summary or breakdown of what the executive order actually says and try to use a lot of the language that it uses, in part because when you hear something titled Ending Radical Indoctrination, that can be pretty broad, right? So it is important, I think, for people to have an understanding of how that term is broken down in the executive order so that we're, kind of get to be on the same page of what we're looking for out there in terms of, what the new policy or approach of the federal government is becoming to stop this. Let me also say that while I am back in the education department and happy to be there, I'm participating in this FAIR webinar in my personal capacity, so please don't hold what I say as some sort of statement of representation on behalf of the government. The purpose, this document, like several of the executive orders, in my opinion, that have come out in these first couple of weeks, is very well written. It's clear. There's no compromise to it. There's no kind of wishy-washiness or sort of half apology behind it. It's like taking a deep breath and saying, you know what, this is what we've been seeing, and this is what we're gonna go after in terms of thinking that this doesn't belong in our K through 12 public schools anymore. So the purpose of the executive order, in its own words, is that parents have witnessed schools indoctrinate their children in radical anti-American ideologies while deliberately blocking parental oversight. That is no doubt an allusion to laws and policies that we have all heard about, from hiding so-called gender transitions from parents to trying to kind of shut parents up by, deeming them to be domestic terrorists for showing up and voicing opposition at school board meetings. The executive order goes on to say this creates an environment in which students are forced to accept these ideologies without question or critical examination. Children are compelled to adopt identities as either victims or oppressors solely based on their skin color and other immutable characteristics, and made to question whether they were born in the wrong body, and to view their parents and their reality as enemies to be blamed. So you can see right away that context is clearly most appropriate in K through 12 schooling, right? We're not talking about a higher education environment where critical examination of things and critical thinking, might be more expected to be part of an approach. We're talking about K through 12 youngsters. The executive order goes on to say these practices sow division, confusion, and distrust, which undermine the very foundations of personal identity and family unity. Imprinting false ideologies on our nation's children not only violates longstanding anti-discrimination civil rights law in many cases, but usurps basic parental authority. And the executive order specifically cites federal laws like FERPA, PPRA, Title IX, and Title VI as examples of federal laws that these kinds of indoctrinating programs and activities in schools tend to violate. And we can get more into any of the specifics around those laws as we go on. Importantly, this executive order has a definition section, and it starts out by incorporating the definitions that were set out in the president's January 20 executive order defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. So right there, you know that the background of this executive order about radical indoctrination in K through 12 schools is going to rely on and incorporate the basic reality that humans come in two and only two sexes, male and female, that's an immutable characteristic, and that if you're talking about women, you're talking about adult human females, talking about men, adult human males. So that's a basis for how to understand language through this executive order. And then importantly, this executive order adds a new term and defines it. And the heart of that is what it terms discriminatory equity ideology. The order defines that to mean an ideology that treats individuals as members of preferred or disfavored groups rather than as individuals, and minimizes agency, merit, and capability in favor of immoral generalizations. like a racial or sex-based superiority or oppressiveness, or that demonizes virtues like merit, excellence, hard work, fairness, objectivity, saying that classifying those kinds of virtues as inherently racist or sexist, or ideologies that promote the idea that the U.S. is fundamentally or inherently racist, sexist, or similarly discriminatory. So, setting that all up, now comes the exciting action part of the executive order. What is to be done? What is being directed to be done about these identified problems of indoctrination? The heart and soul of the executive order is that the president is directing the Education Secretary, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of HHS to create an ending indoctrination strategy and deliver that back to the president within 90 days. That strategy is targeted at eliminating federal funding or support for these types of indoctrination that we've seen, including gender ideology and the discriminatory equity ideology, and protecting parental rights. The plan, the strategy then for targeting those streams of federal funding requires identification carefully agency by agency of all grants or contracts or other direct or indirect support or subsidy of these kinds of ideologies. Importantly, it's directed not just at things that import these ideologies into curricula or school programs or activities for students, but also for educators, for teacher trainings, teacher licensing and certification requirements, and so forth. So it's about as comprehensive, in my view, as the federal government can get. Probably this audience is well aware, but in our constitutional system of federalism, we do have a very bright line distinction where under federal law, the federal government is prohibited from directly controlling or interfering with actual curricula in K through 12 public schools. That is something that our system of government leaves up to state and local governments to direct and control with presumably with parental input. So this kind of executive order, in my view, does all that can be done at a federal level through the executive branch to get at the root of this problem. And most of that is by way of pulling on federal purse strings. In K through 12 funding in particular, generally speaking, overall, federal funding represents about 10% of K through 12 funding. So that may not sound like a lot, but you talk to any school district terrified of losing resources, and that 10% actually is very important. So it's a pulling on the purse strings approach, which is probably the most powerful approach the federal government appropriately, lawfully has with respect to restoring a view in K through 12 schools of equality of opportunity for everybody, non-discrimination based on immutable characteristics, and getting rid of pressure on younger students to feel like the only way to be a good decent person in our society is to buy in and promote policies and worldviews, really, that are in and of themselves outright discriminatory. There's also a direction in the executive order for the Attorney General to work with state and local law enforcement to take action under existing laws against K through 12 school officials and teachers who violate the law by sexually exploiting children, unlawfully practicing medicine, or otherwise unlawfully facilitating the social transition of a minor student. That's good to see. That's very specific, and it's very directed at the practices that so many of us have seen going on, where often through school counselors and school personnel outside of the actual classroom, where we do see a lot of an attitude of, well, especially if it's just social transition, it's no big deal, where in reality, That's a very a very significant intervention psychologically and socially and emotionally into a child's life, and hiding that from parents or promoting it, period, officially in a school system is something that it's good to see that the attorney generals are being directed to look specifically at ways to go after that, including by calling it practice of medicine, by handing out diagnoses and offering treatments for something that they have no business doing that for. There's also a section of the executive order that reestablishes the President's Advisory 1776 Commission promoting patriotic education, directing all agencies to support educational programs on the U.S. Constitution and American history and civics. With the 250th anniversary of July 4th coming up, that features prominently throughout the executive order. Probably feels like a very good time to restore a sense of civics and appreciation for this country and how far we've come. And we acknowledge where we still have yet to go. That's one thing, but I think this overall is getting at the idea that damning America in perpetuity for missing the mark with respect to our aspirational ideals is counterproductive. Leanne wanted me to talk just for a minute or two on what we might expect to see in terms of implementation and changes on the ground at schools. I think a good parallel is with regard to other executive orders over the last couple of weeks in the spaces of eliminating DEI and ending so-called pediatric gender medicine. What we've already seen just in a matter of days is a variety of reactions of institutions that practice those things. Some have preemptively begun already to rethink or even retreat from those kinds of practices. Some have openly doubled down, and some have kind of tried to go underground, by scrubbing their websites or things like that to get off of the radar. And I think it's likely we're going to see a similar variety of reactions in schools and districts and school boards and state education agencies in the coming weeks. Actually cutting funding and reorienting and pulling funding streams isn't an overnight process. You can tell from how the executive order breaks things down that it does, take 90 days first to, present a plan, and then to start to legally and within the bounds of protocol, implement actually pulling back on funding, et cetera. But I do think one thing that parents and students might notice even right away is there might be less confidence among school officials in shutting parents down, refusing to meet with parents about these topics. I think there might be a little more hesitation on the part of schools, even ones that have been unfriendly to parents so far. They might have to at least be thinking twice about keeping an open dialogue or not shutting the door so quickly on parents who want to come in and express those concerns. I think one thing that could start making a difference as far as actions that parents could take right away is working with groups like FAIR or on your own. Anyone can file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights in the Education Department, for example. And this executive order, combined with several of the others that have been issued, means that the Education Department right now is becoming very aware, very active, and very willing to start taking investigatory enforcement action when it receives complaints. So it may, over the last several years, have felt futile to file with OCR. Will they care? Will they do anything? Are they toothless? I think it's worth the investment of time in going ahead and putting problem schools and situations in front of OCR and giving them an opportunity to begin enforcement actions alongside the timeline that this executive order spells out at the agency level.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Yeah, I am still waiting for anything to come out of one OCR complaint that we filed a couple years ago. So hoping maybe this year's my year where we'll get something back there. But thank you for that overview and for kind of your insights about how we might see this roll out. I wanted to go over to Will now. And Will, of course, with your latest book, I'm really interested to hear your take on, how prevalent is, if we're going to use the term indoctrination, like is used in the, how prevalent do you feel like that is in K through 12 schools now? Is this executive order an appropriate, matter for the administration to take up? Do you think there is any threat of kind of government overreach here? I just kind of would love to hear your take on, the EO and whether you think it's necessary and to what extent.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic. Sorry, by the way, if there's some noise in the background. There's some kind of construction going on in the next office to mine. So I'm on campus right now. But yeah, as you mentioned, I wrote the book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And yeah, I think this was extremely prevalent as opposed to just pitching the book. I mean, looking at some data that I've seen recently, American schools for the past 4 or 5 decades. I mean, the argument of sort of Howard Zinn style scholars is, well, culture is taught from the right in the USA. And I actually wrote the book you mentioned to kind of respond to 5 or 6 other books. I mean, the 1619 Projects, A Black View of American History, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. There's a native history of the United States titled Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is really just a series of Native American military defeats since the arrival of the white incomers. And all of this sort of stuff, the claim is that we are a propagandistic society. This is the original book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, actually. The claim is that we are sort of a propagandistic society. And what we're doing is constantly telling people how great the USA is from sort of a conservative standpoint. The problem with that is that all the books I mentioned are actually taught in the schools in the USA. So the exact reverse of kind of the presented narrative, and this is very common with the modern political left, the exact reverse of what's said to be true is in fact true. And if you point this out as a mom or dad, you're often described as being a bit crazy. But when you look at what the schools are actually teaching, I think indoctrination is a fair term for a lot of it. To give a few examples, I mean, there was a study done recently by, I think, Skeptic Research Center, that found that 33% of white women and 66% of black women, the men did a little better, but believe slavery was invented in the very modern West, like the USA and Europe, by white people. I mean, obviously, slavery is one of the oldest human practices. It goes back to ancient Babylon and Israel, Rome, this sort of thing. But I mean, that's a very common belief. 41% of U.S. high school seniors believe that only the United States of America ever had slaves. Eric might correct that percentage for last year, but it's something that we've seen pretty frequently. And that's the result of things that people are being told. So when I started doing prep work for the text in a couple of articles, I mean, this was true for pretty much every topic that I looked at. It was true for discussions of European colonialism. It was true for discussions of the hippie movement and the later waves of feminism. It was true for conversations about white flight, where the accepted narrative is just due to extreme racism, people left their beloved neighborhoods in big cities for no other reason and fled to the outskirts. True for discussions of the use of nuclear bombs in war, this kind of thing. And I mean, it's actually might be useful. So I have a copy of this, and I'm going to, unless you guys object, I'm going to read what some of the stuff the U.S. curriculum on Native Americans actually says. So this is the U.S. government's official Native American contribution series, which I think is from either Ag or Commerce. But from the first lesson that you're supposed to be teaching in the early primary grades, okay, Native Americans have contributed many things to the American way of life today. what you use or do now, many Native Americans have been using or doing for many, many years. That part is true enough. But I go on to note one of the most important of these things apparently was stewardship over the planet. While people of today have just begun, quote, to think about this, indigenous Americans always had a profound love and respect for the natural world. There was a love of every form of life. The Native Americans did not kill anything they could not use. They never killed an animal or even a fish for the sport of it. Back to me, higher forms of ecology were apparently also practiced. Across all or almost all tribes, Native Americans lived in harmony with nature and did not abuse the natural world. Native Americans were ecologists long before the word ever existed, before it was ever used. And they just go on and on. They argue that there was a coherent system of American Indian values that pre-existed white invasion, and they list a couple of them. Respect for your fellow man. There was no prejudice, no major wars. Quote, no Indian nation destroyed another. There were thousands of years of peace before 1492. No poor and no rich, no jails, taxes, borders, or boundaries, limiting the migration or even potential of peoples in any way. So that's pretty typical and pretty representative of what we've been teaching for a while. I mean, the Native Americans, great warriors and poets and so on, but that's an absolutely bullshit description of day-to-day life in American Indian communities. And this sort of thing has effects. So again, a final piece of data, but there was polling recently done on people's perceptions of Native American Indians. And I think it was 71% of whites said they were peaceful and lived in harmony with nature. So for years, we've been teaching all of this stuff, and we've been teaching it across every possible fault line. The majority of single women think that young single women are much happier than married people, for example, which isn't really true. There's a general pervasive narrative that underlies all of this, which to some extent is that our society is bad and doesn't really deserve to exist, in my opinion, but also just going over each data point there. And I mean, I think when you look at I think gender identity, by the way, was the thing that really pushed a lot of parents over the line when it comes to this question of what are they teaching in the schools. I mean, where people during COVID were able to look in at the schooling their kids were receiving, and they were seeing some of this stuff. They were seeing the gender unicorn and the idea that, for example, you don't actually have to have diagnosed gender dysphoria to be trans. You can simply be atypical of what you are supposed to be as a woman or a man. And a lot of people who had been musicians or feminists or people who'd grown up in that sort of integrated business culture in the 70s and 80s were kind of reacting 90s and asking, what is this? This seems completely bizarre. But again, that's the result of set policy to some extent. As I understand, I'm not in either of these fields, but the rule for primary and secondary school teachers, and certainly for therapists, when it came to gender identification until the past couple of years, was total affirmation. So if someone said, certainly in the therapeutic context, I feel like I may be trans, you were strongly encouraged not to ask other questions about eating disorders or sexual abuse or all of these other things that we know correlate very highly, autism for younger girls. The model was simply to say, yes, you almost certainly are trans, and then to proceed forward with that. Would you like to transition socially? Would you consider taking puberty blockers? Would you consider taking hormones? And many people observing this objectively and correctly thought that it was crazy. So you can take that narrative and you can kind of log it across civil rights. The focus of many curricula in the United States is past historical oppression of 10% of the population, Native Americans, gender, feminism, so on, so on, so on. When you look at, is an executive order the best way? Is formal action by the government the best way to regulate the educational institutions? I mean, that's a heck of a question. I mean, as a college professor, no. I mean, I strongly dislike that idea to some extent, but I think it can be necessary at a certain point. I mean, when you talk about higher ed, which is where I actually am, the split between left and right isn't 70-30. People will sometimes just try to say, well, artists, free thinkers, they're more likely to go into academia. That may be true if you're talking about that kind of breakdown. That's not what we're seeing. I mean, last I looked, the most friendly field to conservative academics was engineering, which sort of makes sense, but where you only had a 1.8, I think, Democrats for every Republican. But it went up from there. So in my field of political science, it's a 23 to 1. And sociology, it's 56 to 1. I couldn't name a Republican sociologist. There's a guy in the next department down the hall. It'd be hard to think of one. And I think the apex was communications. Now that that's been separated from business, it was 108 Democrats or liberals to every identified Republican or conservative. So that's what you're talking about. And in secondary ed, at least in the larger urban public schools and in the better prep schools, it's not very different. I mean, the AFT, I believe, made something like 96% of their total pool of financial donations in the direction of the Democrats in the last election cycle. So when you're talking about a situation where you have a really entrenched sort of power base that's on one side of the political aisle and is passing on messaging almost entirely from that side of the political aisle, I do think there's a point where the politicians are going to have to get involved. And the risk there, and I mean, the run-up show broke this down really well. I mean, do you think there's a danger of violations of civil rights from this kind of thing? Potentially, but I would say that there is much more of a danger of litigible action from what's going on now. So, I mean, as the great Thomas Sowell pointed out, there are very few total solutions to problems. What you normally find are trade-off sets. So in the United States, we've solved the problem of hunger, and now 60% of the population is fat. So we're looking at drugs like Ozempic, semaglutide to solve the problem of obesity, but there will be a trade-off there. People are going to be using those the remainder of their life. It's the same thing here. I think that a lot of the things that parents have been complaining about passionately and with cause, the school seems to be transitioning my daughter into a boy. My young white kid who's of Bosnian origins is being told every day he's a member of some kind of imagined oppressor class. This might also be true for your son, for the boy moms. I mean, like all of that also obviously is at least potential grounds for something for a matter moving forward in court. So I think you'll, if anything, have less you'll have less grounds for serious legal action reading through this EO this morning than you will in the situation that we currently have. Ideally, probably last thing, but ideally, yes, what you would have hoped for would have been kind of a come to Jesus moment where the major teachers unions and the faculty associations just said, well, obviously we're not being fair. You know, it's obviously having diversity and political allegiance statements as part of the hiring process isn't normal, and had pulled back from that. But there's been intense resistance from that. I listened to a recent speech by Elizabeth Weiss on anthropology, what's going on in her field of anthropology, where they're literally telling the anthropologists that you can't use human remains in classrooms or take close-up pictures of many of them because that's disrespectful to the ancestors of the native populations here on Turtle Island and so on. I recommend that people Google WEISS and see this actually. But the point of all this is that in her field, the professional association specifically voted not to pull back from quote unquote wokeness. There are things that we are willing to stand for, even if they clash with the traditional values of secondary scholarship or higher academic scholarship. And I think at that point, that's when the president or Ron DeSantis or someone needs to say, well, no, your job is teaching people. Like there aren't any other values that override teaching people. And I think that we're now at the point where that's happened. That would be my final line of analysis there.
Thank you. I mean, it's fascinating to hear the stats that you have and just your take on it in general. I think being in the field of higher education gives you a unique perspective about kind of the dramatic bend in terms of political ideology that's represented. And then, to see that, I mean, when I was a kid, you didn't know anything about your teachers' private lives. Like you didn't know their first name, you certainly didn't know how they voted or who they were married to, any of that. So it's really, I feel like a new phenomenon to see it being like, worn on people's sleeves and advocating for different positions. And so Eric, I want to go to you next and hear also, I mean, your general take on, how necessary is this? And specifically, if you can speak to your experiences in kind of the advent of liberated ethnic studies having taken off across the country, and how you think that this executive order might impact that trend, the push for having courses like that implemented. I would love to hear your thoughts there.
Well, a lot has already been said. That's the condition of going third, I guess. But I will be brief. Um, my main issue with the executive orders that have to do with DEI, divisive concepts, or things like that, is that to the general public, it looks very different than it does to us who are aware of the issues going on in K through 12 and higher education, really, and are aware of what the Trump administration means when it says diversity, equity, and inclusion. The public sees an administration who's against those terms in their original sense, right? A lot of the EOs don't do a great job of explaining that there's a particular kind of DEI that is the problem. I call it critical social justice. Trump's original executive order on this stuff called it divisive concepts. A lot of states have adopted that language. Now it's discriminatory equity ideology. Now, all these terms, I mean, we can talk about the efficacy of that or inefficacy of that later on, but that's really what's going on. And the public's seeing something different. I think it's worth reading some of the aspects of discriminatory equity ideology and what this executive order is trying to get rid of in K through 12 classrooms. And Candace already did like the general definition of this, but I want to do some of the more specific things.
Yeah.
From the executive order, discriminatory equity ideology means an ideology that treats individuals as members of preferred or disfavored groups rather than as individuals and minimizes agency, merit, and capability in favor of immoral generalizations, including that members of one race, color, sex, or national origin are morally or inherently superior to members of another. An individual, by virtue of the individual's race, color, sex, or national origin, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. An individual's moral character or status as privileged, oppressing, or oppressed is primarily determined by the individual's race, color, sex, and so forth. So what it's doing is fighting against discrimination, right? But people don't see that. They see, they see the Trump administration going after true diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we need to do a better job of messaging that for most Americans. My concern with the executive order happens around the concept of patriotic education, right? This isn't just against those divisive concepts I just mentioned. It's also promoting certain things, which comes dangerously close to indoctrination itself. So I wanted to read a couple of these and to show you what I'm talking about. So the executive order promotes patriotic education, which is a presentation of the history of America grounded in an accurate, honest, good things, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling characterization of America's founding and foundational principles. You may like all those things, right? But accurate and honest. After that, those things are values, right, that are put there that apparently educators will be compelled to do. A clear examination of how the United States has admirably grown closer to its noble principles throughout its history. You can teach history without, mentioning, admirable qualities or anything like that. The concept that commitment to America's aspirations is beneficial and justified. All right, so these are a lot of opinions that are being kind of mandated here to be taught in the classroom. I don't want to do what we're fighting against, right? We're fighting against indoctrination, and that comes dangerously close to sounding like indoctrination. So I think that's an issue we need to keep an eye on. I think it's something that the Trump administration does clearly want, and Trump was talking about this during his first term. So it's no surprise there. But let's not fight indoctrination with indoctrination, is basically what I'm trying to say. Now,
Yeah.
you asked me about my knowledge or thoughts about liberated ethnic studies and things like that. Well, I'll say this. I am a former associate professor of rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. I resigned. Why did I resign? Because of what Will said about my field. Rhetoric and composition is, a subcategory communications. What was it, Will? 108 to 1 was the liberal conservative?
Yeah, that is correct. 108 to 1.
Yeah. So I ran away, is basically what is happening. Now, not that I identify as conservative, but according to this ideology, I'm extreme right wing, quote unquote. I'm quoting people, all right, who have called me that for things that would have gotten me called a bleeding heart liberal 10 years ago, right? So a lot of that's happening as well. Now, after George Floyd, a lot of people, and this was a good thing to come out of a tragic event, right? But after George Floyd, people wanted to do something. People saw that video of him, dying tragically, and they said to themselves, "Okay, we have to figure out something here, right? We can't just watch that and go on like everything's normal." That was a great opportunity, but some bad faith actors, in my opinion, decided to use that opportunity to push their ideology, which is inherently illiberal, right? And something that isn't going to unify America, right? So, and we know what that is: critical social justice, discriminatory equity practices, things like that. We know what those things are. I think in academia, they may be here to stay. Well, for a while anyway. But K through 12 is something we can do something about quicker, in my opinion. And executive orders like this are very good, but the language has to be, revisited, in my opinion, just to make sure we know clearly what the Trump administration wants out of all of this. I think I'll stop talking.
No, that's really helpful. I really appreciate what you said about the patriotic education piece of it. I had a similar reaction to that. You get into some concerns about kind of, free speech principles, and it's obviously would be tragic to fight fire with fire. So thank you for raising that point. And I think also a couple of the comments or questions that have been raised are from folks who are in blue states and, have kind of made the comment that, like you said, Eric, when someone reads a Trump executive order talking about DEI and gender ideology, it's like, okay, he's clearly a bigot. That's the reaction, right? They don't know what it actually means. I mean, it's been interesting in my work at FAIR, though, that you do run across folks who do understand, like they understand that their kids are being taught that their oppressors are oppressed, and they're just like sort of taking it. It's like, this is what we have to do to set things straight in this country. I mean, is there a way to orient the conversation, the dialogue around this to better like have a holistic understanding and we're all on the same page?
I've been trying to for the past 5 years. I can write as many op-eds and give as many speeches as possible, and people out there will, have the incorrect interpretation of what the administration is calling DEI, right? Or this new term that I already lost in my notes, but divisive concepts, things like that.
Right.
I don't know what else to do. I can knock on doors, I guess. I can rent out billboards or something like that. But short of those things, people are already not set in their ways. I don't want to say that. What I do want to say is that they're not thinking critically about the words diversity, equity, and inclusion because in their minds, they don't have to. Everybody knows what those words mean, right? And it was clever on the part of the critical social justice advocates, right, to use these well understood terms for their own purposes. But yeah, that was too good of a strategy on their part because I don't know how to fight it really.
Super effective. Well, and that's kind of along the lines of the concerns I have with liberated ethnic studies. I mean, if you tell someone who knows nothing about it, like, oh, your kid's going to take an ethnic studies class, that sounds great. Like, my kid's going to learn about people from different cultures and different backgrounds and empathy and all the things. And, I think critical social justice is really hitting it exactly right. I mean, the underpinnings of liberated ethnic studies are very much critical theory, liberation theory, decolonizing, all the things. And the curricula that I've seen out there, in school districts in California, I mean, up and down the West Coast, it's really common, Minnesota, Vermont, Colorado, there very much is this discriminatory equity ideology baked into liberated ethnic studies courses. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see if there are litigation efforts taken up around that line of course and curriculum, because there has been such a push. There's, that there are a lot of proponents of liberated ethnic studies getting it plugged into the schools, and they all kind of look a lot alike. So I'm just curious if anyone has thoughts on that.
Be nice to have an alternative to things like Black Lives Matter in schools,
Ooh,
right?
FAIR's working on on an ethnic studies curriculum alternative.
I know. That's why I said
Go
it.
ahead, plug away,
Yeah.
Eric. We
No, no,
welcome it.
Yeah, if we can provide alternatives and sell them, quote unquote, properly, then I think that's our best bet. Um, we could go after the liberated ethnic studies, sure, but if we do that and have something else to offer us, here you go, take a look at this. I think that bodes better for us.
Yeah, it's great.
I mean, to kind of jump in there, I don't see anything inherently wrong with the idea of ethnic studies, or for that matter, women's studies, Black American studies. I mean, those are all things worth studying. The problem from a strategic standpoint is that when those fields began in the 1960s and 70s, they were immediately and intentionally captured. The idea was that you'd find a way to get the extreme radicals into the academy and then have them train kind of the next wave of scholars there. But I mean, yeah, when you talk about FAIR, I know has worked on some ethnic studies curricula. To plug another group, 1776 Unites, kind of the Black business and social science community, at least on the right's response to the 1619 Project. We actually, under Bob Woodson, drew up a response to the 1619 educational curriculum. And this has kind of flown under the radar, but something like 20,000 school districts have decided to use it. These are mostly smaller Catholic schools, that kind of thing, but it's available on the 1776 Unites website. And it's just sort of, instead of discussing terrible atrocities only, you also talk about things like the Rosenwald schools, where people of all backgrounds came together and improved the country. And this is obviously a part of Black history. The historically Black colleges are a part of Black history, so on. The one thing that I would worry about when it comes to some of this stuff that 1776 ran into in a couple states, and I think FAIR will probably run into, is that there are often very limiting restrictions on what's meant by ethnic studies or what has to be taught in, say, California. I forget whether it was this group that I talked about this with at one point, but the ethnic studies curriculum in a lot of states doesn't include any whites, for example. I mean, which seems to be a bit of an omission. Like, there's nothing on the immigrant experience, Irish, Italian, so on, Americans. What has to be taught is, the history of Black Americans, Hispanic Americans. And I would assume that there's specific negative incidents and so on that often have to be included in that. So without just rambling before I read the description, the worry is that you're kind of playing on the other guy's field, right? Like, if you draw up some of these, like there seems to be an attempt on the right now to figure out how to ethically handle transgenderism. So, like, for example, will Caitlyn Jenner become a spokesman from the right side of the field on these issues and so on? And the question is that possible? Like, is there a middle ground where, as a male with a penis, you can use women's locker rooms? And it strikes me as being kind of the same thing here. Like, I think the curriculum from your team will be good, but are there states where it won't be usable because it is? Like, are a lot of people, you see this with charter schools too. Like, what are the requirements to be a school? What are the organizations in the USA and overseas that you in practice have to comply with? So if you want to do sort of traditional education with the nuns, with the rulers, reading books in Latin and so on, can you? And I think that all of this is going to have to be parsed out over the next 5, 10 years. Like, are these fields that are worth competing in to some extent?
Yeah, no, those are really good points and really good, considerations that'll have to be taken. Eric, were you gonna jump in there?
I was going to say something. I'm not really piggybacking on what Will said. As usual, he was very comprehensive, and there's no need for that. But I do want to revisit what I was talking about with higher ed and the 108 to 1 ratio. My field is heavily pedagogical. And what I mean by that is it's a lot of teaching teachers how to teach, right? Um, which can clue you into why the ratio is so lopsided. And it reminds me of the culpability of the ed schools in all of this, right? A lot of this stuff is being pushed to the teachers there. So, they come into high school with that ideology ready to go, and hopefully that we mitigate that to some degree, right? But these ed schools are something that we need to take a look at too. I'm actually a little surprised that there hasn't been an executive order specifically for that, and we need one.
That's a really good point. That's something we've talked about a lot. Can go from hiring based on skin color to now hiring based on political viewpoint to try to even things out. It's like, again, how do you correct these situations? I want to jump to some of the questions that we have here in the FA or in the Q&A. So one of the questions is, and maybe Candace, this would be good for you to answer. Do you have ideas? I mean, you might not know yet, you can't speak for the government, but where could legal action come from? Do you think that you see the strategy in implementing this EO being, looking for private plaintiffs, or are they DOJ actions that go after, folks who they think are violating civil rights laws here?
Well, I think it's going to be a combination. And I think we're seeing that under several of the executive orders where teams have stepped back and tried to examine what are the existing legal channels that we have at our disposal to extricate, at least at a federal level, promotion of these things that we've been identifying as very negative. So I think there's going to be a combination looking at private civil liability. Even some things are going to fall under potential criminal activity, and then the standard administrative enforcement that agencies under that have any piece of Title VI or Title IX, like Ed and HHS and even Department of Agriculture. There are about 20 agencies that have enforcement authority under civil rights statutes like that. So you put all that together, and several of those things can be parallel, by the way.
Yeah.
And I think there are actually quite a number of tools that are going to be put into effect relatively quickly, even in blue states. And I know that's a concern that people have too, as well. And there is a level of reality to the idea that executive orders like this, on a first level, the most effectiveness is going to be with respect to schools and institutions that already wanted to be doing the right thing, as we're collectively defining it here. And this will empower those institutions to go ahead and say, good, we don't have to go this opposite direction. We haven't wanted to, and now we're feeling like we're backed up solidly by the government. It's going to be a slower and more complicated thing to get at the states that are actively calling themselves sanctuary states for all kinds of these activities, and individual institutions and school districts that have bought into the approach that these executive orders are going after. But there are I think, a lot of tools at a lot of levels that are going to come into play. And I think the caution that Eric and Wilfred have talked about is exactly right, making sure that we don't do that in a way that crosses over into, feeling like we're just imposing an opposite ideology, but rather truly trying to ground enforcement or pursuing or implementation of all of this, really trying to ground it in first principles, back to our Constitution. What is true academic freedom? What is genuine diversity of thought and freedom of expression and freedom of speech and due process and all those good things that aren't supposed to be viewpoint dependent and are supposed to be content neutral, and lay the groundwork and level the playing field from that perspective, not just replacing one stifling counterproductive worldview for any other.
Thank you. One of the questions is specifically for Eric. This person asked, you said you're not sure DEI ideology, as we understand it, can be dislodged from academia. Can you elaborate on that a bit more, and what factors do you think make K through 12 different, short of my suggestion of providing a litmus test to all the new teachers going into schools of education?
Well, for one thing, the students tend to stay on campus. They don't go home after classes. So that creates a bubble of illiberalism throughout colleges. I see this as an issue of what is called prefigurative politics. And what that is when you try to act out the world you want to see, right? So Occupy Wall Street tried to do this, right? They were acting out the world they wanted to see. The problem is you're supposed to stop doing that and go home eventually into the real world and act like you're in the real world. That's not happening in college. The prefiguration stays, it's permanent. And if that's the case, then, these divisive concepts are in the air. They're all over the place. And certain disciplines are worse than others. I just talked about mine. The sciences are a little better, but they're getting worse. Engineering is the best, as Will said. But when everything you're doing is about this stuff, you're going to soak it in, and that's the point, right? Add that to the ed school thing and the fact that grad students are being taught to teach this, and you have the perfect storm.
Oh, that's helpful. One of the other questions, just really quickly before we wrap up, was about, the College Board AP curriculum. Does anyone have insights on whether, for example, the AP African American Studies program that, this commenter noted is one-sided? How do we think that, looking, kind of doing a deep dive or review of that, is there any ability or calling for in something like the EO and, the federal government to look at that and do anything that could be corrective to provide a more neutral presentation of that material?
I think that's kind of like the wonky nuts and bolts stuff in leadership. I have no idea. Candace might have no idea whether anyone plans on doing something like that, but I don't see any reason, if you're talking about the federal Department of Education overseen by the president, that you couldn't do that. So yeah, for example, the other day, Trump issued his announcement for the start of Black History Month. And I know there'd been some discussion among Black academics and business people I know about, like, what's he going to say? Like, is he going to do this at all? And what he actually did was the usual formal, pleasant announcement. But he said, when he listed 10 great Black figures, he named, Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas. And it was actually quite pleasant to see. He just went through, you don't want to say on our side, but very impressive Black people that had made contributions maybe a little more atypically or from the right. I don't see any reason that you couldn't mandate the teaching of some of Dr. Soul's work or something like that from the overall level of being the chief executive, the person in charge of that entire branch of government. And hopefully we will see some things like that, actually. Kind of last comment, but the thing that struck me the most about the Trump administration this time was competence, actually. So, I mean, Trump has some positives and negatives. I mean, like the thing where he and the presidents of Mexico and Canada have been yelling back and forth at each other for 2 days about tariffs on whiskey. I think that's what a lot of people associate with a Donald Trump government. Some good, some bad, very, very televised, very Roman. But I mean, in fact, when Trump returned to power, he had a stack of something like 200 executive orders ready to go. And they mandated very specific things like no flag, but the American flag can be flown at any of our overseas embassies, which are listed in detailed order. You know, there's a hilarious one called Prioritizing People Over Fish that focuses on how to use water in the different watersheds that the federal government has access to, and so on down the line. So, yeah, I guess the point is, sure, as far as I understand the relevant law, if you're the person in charge of that entire agency, Department of Education obviously doesn't run any schools, which is a major critique of DOE, but you can set educational curricular standards. So if there's a standard for AP Black History, and that's not set at the state level, yeah, you kind of decide what's going to be involved in that. So hopefully that will happen.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, we're 3 minutes over, but this has been such an amazing discussion. I just wanted to give everyone, you know, if anyone has any last comment they want to make, the opportunity to do that. Anyone? No? Thank you all. Candace, Eric, Will, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of you in the audience watching. And keep your eye out for more announcements of other webinars coming up. There will be one on Thursday evening at 6:30 Eastern about kind of the same topic, but kind of the direction of higher education. So there will be, you can check our social media feeds for signups for that. And then we'll be hosting other webinars coming up next week as well. So keep an eye out for those. Thank you all so much for being with us, and everyone have a great rest of the day.